The sun is setting, and its golden rays spread across the castle, lighting up the corridors. Tessa is walking through the halls, looking worried. The sunlight makes everything glow as she sighs, thinking about how she wants to get Janet a present before she leaves. Tessa opens the door to her room and calls out for Manny, but doesn't see her. She wonders where Manny could be. Stepping back into the hallway, she spots Manny just leaving Hert's room. Tessa calls her name, and Manny jumps a little. Manny turns around, surprised and worried when she sees Tessa. She asks if Tessa is really there, almost like she can't believe her eyes. Tessa tells her that she just arrived. Manny, looking flustered, tucks a stubborn brown curl behind her ear and apologizes, explaining that she was busy tidying up his lordship's room. Tessa looks Manny over and asks if she's feeling okay, because she notices that Manny is sweating. Manny gently pushes Tessa away from Hert's room, saying it's nothing, maybe just her age making her feel hot easily these days. Manny gives a shaky smile and tells Tessa she will help her get changed. Tessa nods and says she understands. In her room, Tessa looks at her reflection sadly as Manny brushes her hair. She's already changed into her night clothes, which are a green robe and ruby red innerwear. Tessa wonders what's going on with Manny because it seems like she keeps disappearing. She calls out Manny's name, and Manny responds. Tessa asks her what she would like to receive the most if she were Lady Janet. Manny looks confused, so Tessa explains that Janet is leaving the castle, and she wants to give her a present. She asks Manny if she has any ideas. Tessa thinks to herself that she doesn't want to ask Manny awkward questions. Manny taps her chin and says, "Let me see." After a moment, Manny suggests money. Tessa looks confused and repeats, "Money." Manny explains that Janet will need money once she leaves, then quickly adds that it's probably not the kind of present Tessa had in mind. Tessa agrees, but says that money might actually be a good idea, although she doesn't have any herself. Manny asks why she doesn't ask Hert for money. Tessa questions her, as if she didn't hear her right. Manny claps her hands in excitement and says that if Tessa asks Hert nicely, he might agree, especially since she wants to help Lady Janet. Tessa wonders if Hert is her only source of money. She's sure he wouldn't mind giving her a small amount. Then she touches her jewelry and thinks about selling it. Her reflection in the mirror seems to mock her, saying that after all Hert has done, now she wants to ask him for money, and if she really thinks of herself as the lady of the house. Tessa gasps and tries to hide her tears from Manny. Manny notices Tessa's distress and asks if she is okay, and if she should get Dr. Kenneth. Tessa tells her not to worry. Turning to Manny, Tessa says not to mind what she just said, and that she didn't mean anything by it. She also tells Manny to go. Manny nods, looking confused, and leaves the room. She sighs in relief and quickly dashes down the corridor. As twilight covers the land, no stars are in the sky, and moonlight shines into Tessa's room. Tessa turns in bed, and her face slowly becomes pale. In her dreams, she goes back 7 years to when one of the butlers in the castle told her it's a common fate for gladiator slaves. The butler continues, saying it's sad, but nobody comes back from there alive, and that Tessa should just forget about him. She hears voices saying it's all lies, that she must be dreaming, but wonders why she is dreaming of that time again. Then she hears her own voice, turns around with a tear-streaked face, and calls out for Hert. Hert appears in front of her, drenched in blood, with wounds and swords. He says Tessa sent him to hell and asks if she is happy now. Tessa calls out his name. The blooded Hert asks if this is the reward for loving her, and if she ever loved him. He says he'll do to Tessa what she did to him. Tessa says yes and bares her neck to him. He wraps his hand around her throat and squeezes. She tells him to do it so she can be with him. Tessa thinks, finally, she can rest. She thanks Hert. The voice from earlier screams her name over and over. It screams for her to wake up. Tessa opens her eyes and calls out his name sleepily. Hert stares at her with concern and asks if she is all right. She stammers, saying she is fine and that she just had a nightmare. Hert yells, "Fine," and Tessa looks at him confused. He asks who strangles their own neck while having a nightmare. Tessa says that she's never had any problems. Hert pulls her into a hug, saying he was worried sick about her. Tessa thinks to herself that when she used to have nightmares, there was no one there for her. Now she has Hert and wants to be with him again, but she wonders if she can dare to hope for it. Tears drip from her eyes and fall onto his shoulder. She admits to herself that she is afraid of what she might do and silently begs Hert not to ever let her go. Meanwhile, in another part of the estate, Elena looks at the starry sky. Her maid, Senna, walks in with a tray. Elena asks her how it went, and Senna replies that she thinks it went well. Elena says that the more, the merrier, but it feels strange to celebrate over rats. Senna tells her that life is full of surprises, and Elena replies that things do seem to be working out. She says she feels sorry for the child, but they need to focus on the goal because they are almost there. She gets up from the wheelchair and uses her walking stick to walk. She looks at the letter on the table and thinks to herself that she knows there's no way around it. In the casino, people are rolling dice and betting with cards and coins. Ferdale laughs, holding a good hand. A man in a black face mask watches him while throwing his arm around a beautiful woman and sipping on alcohol. The man in the mask whispers something to his companion. Soon, another man approaches Ferdale and addresses him with his title. He whispers something to Ferdale, who asks, "What?" Ferdale stands up with a grunt, swearing about being interrupted just when he was doing well. The man apologizes and Ferdale tells him not to worry about it and to just lead the way. They walk down a dark corridor, and Ferdale glances around nervously as sweat drips down his face. They reach a large set of brown doors. The man opens them and gestures for Ferdale to go through. Ferdale wonders to himself how many secret passages there are in this place as he walks through the doors. He remembers walking into a magnificent room a few days ago and thinking it was like heaven, with everything perfect and unlimited chips. But now, he's not so sure. He is led into another room where another man greets him with his title. The man in the black mask sits in a chair, and another man in a red mask stands beside him. The man in the red mask says they've been waiting for Ferdale and introduces his collaborator. Ferdale looks pleased and reaches out his hand for a handshake, saying he's charmed. Before he can shake hands, a sword is placed by his neck, stopping him from coming closer. Ferdale swallows and wonders if the masked men outrank him. He asks himself who these people are. The man in the masks asks if they can get down to business, and Ferdale repeats the question. The man in the red mask says recovering Jutted estate means war. Ferdale repeats war like he's asking a question. Back at the castle, Tessa is writing and thinks to herself that writing is hard, and she isn't improving very quickly. Manny calls for attention using her title, and says that Hert would like to walk with her before lunch. Tessa smiles and says she'll come right away. Tessa walks through the halls toward Hert's office in a flowing green gown. She asks Manny if the dress matches the earrings and wonders if she should wear the amber set instead. Manny looks puzzled and asks what she means. Manny says she thinks the earrings Tessa is wearing are lovely and tells her that Hert is waiting. Tessa agrees, saying they should do. Manny nods and sighs in relief. Meanwhile, Hert sits in a burdizzo, folding his hands and lost in thought. Tessa walks up to him with a bright smile and calls his nickname. She apologizes, asking if she kept him waiting too long. Hert reassures her that he just arrived and wanted to take a walk with her before lunch. Tessa nods excitedly and says yes. They hold hands and walk along the grassy pathway. Hert watches her, deep in thought. Earlier that day, one of Hert's men hands him an amber set of jewelry. He tells Hert that they came up on the black market and were sold by Manny. Hert quickly looks at his men and asks if he is sure the jewelry belongs to Tessa. The guard says that the jeweler confirmed they are one of a kind. Hert nods and tells the guard to keep watching for now. He thinks to himself that it's possible Manny took the jewelry secretly, and Tessa might not even know they are missing. As he walks, Hert stops and wonders if it's possible that Tessa sold the jewelry herself. He considers the idea that Tessa might be secretly getting rid of her jewels to save up some money. Tessa looks at Hert, confused, and calls him Herty. Hert grabs her and pulls her close, pressing her against him. He buries his face in her shoulder and calls out her name. He tells her never to betray him again, and asks her to say something as they look into each other's eyes. Tessa promises that she won't. Tears fill her eyes as she admits that she knows she shouldn't be like this, but she can't help it. Hert calls her name with uncertainty. He asks if they can be together, and Tessa finishes the question, saying, "Be together." Hert cups her face and tells her that she knows she will only be a burden, but she can't give him up. He pulls her close and kisses her passionately. He thinks to himself that he fought hard to get here to ask Tessa why she betrayed him, but the truth is he just wanted to see her one more time. He breaks the kiss, but keeps cupping her face. He says it's clear that she doesn't understand. He tells her that he is hers now and always. He says he loves her and gives her a big hug. Hert and Tessa are close and confess their love for each other. Tessa thinks to herself that there's something she needs to tell him first, even though he might already know. As she lies in bed with Hert, her mind keeps wandering. She thinks she wants to explain everything to him herself, and needs to do that before she tells him that her love for him has never changed. Janet asks Manny if she looks like a fugitive, because that's how it seems, as she struggles to lock her luggage. Manny opens Janet's luggage, and says it's time for them to leave. Janet screams about her clothes. Manny says she can't take everything because they need to travel light. Janet cries, holding an amber dress to her chest, and asks why they need to leave so suddenly. Manny grabs the dress from Janet's hand and says they were going to leave anyway, just a bit sooner than expected. Janet asks why they are fleeing in the middle of the night, and why no one tells her anything. She walks to the glass doors and flings them open, complaining that it's hot inside. She thinks to herself that all the other wives are gone, and it's only them left in the annex, which is too quiet. She hears rustling in the bushes and wonders if it's Lee Borwen's men or Sir Shine. The Marquess de Borwen started working at Juttett's 2 years ago. Most of Sir Shine's men are from Lee Borwen's private army, and a third of the castle staff has been planted by Borwen as well. Sir Shine has his own men, taken from the battlefield, but in the end, they are all just pieces in Borwen's game. Janet thinks to herself that Borwen will likely bail them out if things go wrong, but she has a bad feeling about it. Janet turns to Manny and asks if she is sure that no one will see them. Manny assures her that they managed to sneak out Furdale. Janet says they had Jeffrey to help them before, but he's not here now. Manny tells her not to worry because everything is ready. Janet says that Sir Shine will be furious if he finds out they were involved. Manny replies that Sir Shine won't find out. Janet thinks to herself that she feels bad about leaving without saying goodbye to Tessa. She wonders what might happen to Tessa, especially since she has a man who worships her. Janet says they should have one last cup of tea and asks Manny to bring out the lemon tart. Manny agrees and goes to get it. Meanwhile, one of Hert's guards stands under a tree and listens to their conversation through the window. Sunrise rays shine into the room and reflect on Tessa and Hert in bed. Tessa hums as she starts to wake up. Suddenly, she feels Hert stir and cuddle her. He asks how she's feeling. Tessa says she's all right, and Hert says he wants to check, making Tessa blush. He gently rubs under her eyes, notices they are a bit red, and says he'll get some ice. Tessa smiles and says thank you. Just then, there's a knock on the door. One of the guards calls for Hert, using his title. Hert asks what's going on. The guard says there is urgent news from the scouts. Hert quickly gets out of bed, puts on his clothes, and says he's coming. Tessa sits up with a cloth wrapped around her chest, watching Hert head for the door. She tries to listen to the conversation, but doesn't hear anything. She asks what's going on and if something is wrong. She gets up from the bed and quickly gets dressed. Hert comes back from the door and says he'll be there right away. He tells Tessa that she will have to eat alone today because something urgent has come up. He cups her face and rubs her cheek as she asks what's happening. Hert reassures her that it's nothing to worry about and that he'll be back soon. Tessa starts to say something, but doesn't manage to speak. Hert wonders why she looks so serious. He turns away and says he'll see her later. Tessa's eyes widen, and she thinks to herself that she has to tell him now. Tessa calls out to him, asking him to wait. He asks what's wrong and tells her not to worry because everything is fine. He cups her cheek and kisses her forehead. He tells her to stay in her room today and not to go outside the castle. He asks if she will wait for him until he returns. She nods. Tessa pleads with him to come back safely. She says he should come back today because there's something she needs to tell him, and he should be careful. Hert looks at her with a dry expression and says, "Just like that." He hums in confusion, then laughs and taps her forehead, saying he was just joking. He reminds her that she doesn't need to tell him anything if she's not ready yet. He assures her that he'll wait for her, no matter how long it takes. He says there's no need to rush and they'll take things slowly. One day, they'll laugh together again like they used to, talking all night. Hert is sure of it. Hert turns to leave, and Tessa stands in the middle of the room with her hands clasped, as if she is praying. She tells herself that Hert is right. She just needs to be patient, and maybe one day, like Hert says, they'll be able to return to how things used to be. Tessa sits at a table, trying to write a letter, but keeps striking out her words. She wonders how she should start the letter, gets frustrated, and crumples the paper into a ball. She thinks that formal writing is so hard, and that Janet would laugh if she saw her first draft. She wanted to ask Elena for advice, but finds Senna instead. Senna tells her that Elena isn't feeling well. Tessa wonders why she hasn't seen Elena for a while and notices how quiet it is today. Hert isn't around either, and she wonders if something is wrong. She can't stop thinking about how he looked this morning. Manny runs in, calling Tessa by her title. Tessa turns to Manny and asks what's going on. Manny tells Tessa that it's Hert, and he's been badly wounded. Tessa drops her pen, stunned by Manny's words. Manny grabs Tessa's hand and says they need to go right away because everyone is already there. Manny pulls her out of the room, hurrying along. Manny reassures her that it's just a little further and there's no time to waste. As they enter a dark corridor, Tessa asks Manny to wait. She wonders where they are going and why Manny is taking her here. Tessa tells Manny that she's hurting her and to let go. She drags her hand away and rubs her sore wrist. Tessa asks where they are and where all the guards are, feeling that something is wrong. Manny apologizes to Tessa, who asks what's wrong. Manny looks at her with regret, and says she had no choice and hopes Tessa can forgive her. Tessa tries to ask Manny what she means, but suddenly, a cloaked figure sneaks up behind her and covers her face with their hands. Tessa struggles, but is pushed to the floor. Tessa is tied up and lying on the floor. She remembers what happened moments ago, struggling against the men, who are dragging her toward the carriage. She asks them where they are taking her. Tears well up in her eyes as she screams for Hert. Manny complains about the noise Tessa is making and asks for someone to quiet her. Tessa keeps struggling and shouting for them to let her go. One of the men puts a gag in her mouth, and they toss her onto the floor. Manny looks at her with a sneer, and says that Tessa should have been more careful, and not so trusting. The maid laughs and mocks Tessa, saying that she has no one to blame but herself. She keeps asking if it's Tessa's fault and insults her. Manny adds that Hert isn't any smarter, and won't let Tessa fool him into selling her off as a gladiator slave. Tessa screams under her blindfold and cries. She thinks to herself that she never tried to fool Hert. Her conscience taunts her, asking why she didn't tell him about the contract. She could have told him at any time, but stayed silent. Manny interrupts her thoughts, saying she should have told Hert if he really mattered to her, and insults her further. She slams the carriage door shut, and it drives away. Tessa thinks that this isn't what she wanted and tries to speak through the gag in her mouth. Meanwhile, Hert and one of his men stand on the roof, looking at the ramparts of the jutted estate. The guard tells Hert that the group has been stationed there since morning, and no one really knows what they are doing or what their plans are. Hert looks at the group closely and notices that while they are well armed, they aren't carrying any banner or identification. He comments to the guard that it looks like they are a battalion of mercenaries. However, something feels off because their commander is nowhere to be seen, and their numbers are too small to mount a serious attack on the estate. He thinks they'd be lucky if they could even get past the ramparts. As Hert thinks about it, he wonders who might have sent them and why. If their goal was simply to send a message to the Marquess, they could have just sent a spy instead of this group. He starts to suspect that there's something more going on. The whole situation seems strange, and he feels uneasy about what might be coming next. He tells the guard to let him know immediately if they spot anything unusual. The guard nods and confirms that he will keep a close watch. The strange armed men start to march away, and one of Hert's men catches his attention. Hert feels a strange, uneasy feeling, similar to what he felt back in the gladiator pits. Suddenly, a messenger runs up to Hert, saying there's urgent news from the castle. Hert asks what it is now. The messenger says that 2 ladies are missing. Hert's eyes widen, and he demands to know who's missing. He grabs the messenger by the collar and looks at him fiercely. The messenger, trembling, says it's Lady Janet and Lady Tessa. Hert lets go of him and repeats Tessa's name in shock. In another part of the kingdom, men in suits play instruments while formally dressed men and women chat in a brightly lit room. A man and a woman sit on purple thrones. The woman looks irritated and thinks to herself, "For the love of God." She turns to her companion, who seems to be absent-minded about the events around them. She leans against him and rests her head on his shoulder. She asks if he understands how important this party is. He replies that he does, and it's to honor the Tehran delegation. Then he wonders what will happen if the Chaldeus miners go on strike as everyone has been predicting. Won't Tehitra try to make another deal? The woman says that once the railroad opens, they will control everything. The man's eyes widen as he questions how he can smile when the canal is built. The woman's irritation grows as she tells him to follow her instructions, and that he's useless as a husband. The man replies that he's trying, and she tells him to try harder, and he apologizes. She waves him off, telling him not to worry because she never expected much from him anyway. As she speaks, she wonders if she really knew what Anu was planning. Anu had mentioned that the deal with Tehira would be called off soon, and she's curious about what might be happening behind the scenes. The woman picks up a glass of wine from a passing waiter and takes a sip, trying to calm her nerves. As she sips, her eyes drift around the room. Suddenly, her gaze freezes when she spots the Duke of Callias across the room. Her eyes widen with surprise and intrigue. He has striking blue eyes and blonde hair, and he is first in line to the throne. She had been waiting for him to arrive, and had been wondering when he would make an appearance at this gathering. Hert rushes down the halls towards Tessa's room, shouting at the guards to open the door. They unlock it, and he storms into an empty room. He looks around in panic. He walks over to the letter Tessa was writing to Janet earlier and reads it. It says, "Thank you. I'll never forget what you did for me. Even though we have to part, I wish you well. Goodbye. I'll miss you, Tessa." Hert crumples the letter in his hand, wondering if it's some kind of cruel joke. He slams his hand on the table, remembering that Tessa told him to come back safely. He thinks about how she had something important to tell him, and wonders how she could do this to him. One of the guards calls out to Hert, using his title. Hert asks where Janet Belrodum is. The guard says they found her, but she hasn't crossed the ramparts yet. Hert nods, saying that's what he expected. Hert tells himself that he's done trying to understand why Tessa betrayed him. He thinks he'll never really get it, and has given up hope that things can go back to how they were before. As he thinks this, the ink on the table tips over and spills, making a mess on the letter and dripping onto the floor. Instead, Hert decides he'll make Tessa pay so she won't ever leave him again. He thinks that the difference between today and the day she first betrayed him is that nobody can stop him now. He tells his guard to lead the way. As the horse pulls the carriage down the road with Tessa and Manny inside, Tessa pushes the blinds aside and looks around, hoping the coast is clear. She tries to call out quietly, but her words are muffled by the gag in her mouth. Manny whispers to Tessa, saying she's going to untie her now and asks Tessa to stay quiet. She starts to undo the ropes. Manny bows her head and tells Tessa that she never meant to put her in danger. She explains that they told her it was just to confirm Tessa's identity, and that she had no choice because her family was being threatened. Tears fall from Tessa's eyes as she calls out Manny's name. Manny pulls Tessa's hand and says to follow her. She tells Tessa she'll keep watch while Tessa escapes. Tessa shakes her head and says she won't leave without Manny. Manny pushes Tessa out of the carriage and says she knows Tessa has a kind heart. She tells her not to worry and to go while apologizing. Tessa calls out Manny's name and grabs her hand. Manny turns and runs into the bushes, whispering that she'll go get help and telling Tessa to wait. Tessa starts sprinting through the forest, looking for anyone. She hopes to find someone who can help. Two figures in black cloaks move slowly through the dark forest, holding a lantern that lights their way. Tessa, spotting them in the distance, feels a rush of relief and hope. She runs toward them, calling out loudly for help to make sure they hear her. As she gets closer, one of the figures pulls back their cloak to reveal Janet. Janet looks at Tessa with a mix of surprise and recognition, calling her name. Exhausted from her frantic escape, Tessa leans against a nearby tree for support. She looks at Janet with tired eyes and calls out her name again, asking how it's possible that Janet is here. Janet seems puzzled and wants to know what's going on. But Tessa doesn't answer her question directly. Instead, she insists that they can't stay where they are. Janet asks what she means, clearly confused. Tessa tells Janet urgently that they need to run and get away quickly. But then, she suddenly hesitates as she remembers Manny, who is still in danger. Tessa's worry for Manny makes her pause, not sure what to do next. Janet hears movement in the bushes and voices talking about checking for any sight of them and spreading out. Janet's companion says they need to leave. Janet nods and tells Tessa to hold her hand and follow her. Tessa protests, worried about Manny. Janet insists they need to run, and that there's nothing they can do for Manny right now. The three of them hurry into the forest. After a while, the three of them reach a carriage. Janet sighs with relief and says, "Here we are." She explains that she was worried they were too late, but they made it just in time. She tells the driver that this is their carriage. The driver looks at them, puzzled, and says Janet mentioned only 2 people. Janet tells him it's a long story and to just start moving, as sweat drips down her face. The driver tells the horse to go, and the carriage starts rolling. Janet sighs with relief and says, "Thank goodness." She takes off her cloak, and Tessa starts to fidget nervously. Tessa calls out Janet's name and asks what happened, her eyes darting to Janet's stomach. Janet scratches her neck and says it's a fake. She tells Tessa not to worry about it and asks who she's running from. Tessa tells Janet everything that happened, and Janet is shocked, shouting that Tessa was kidnapped. Tessa just nods, feeling a mix of guilt and worry. Janet is curious and confused, wondering who would have the nerve to kidnap Tessa, especially when Hert is supposed to be protecting her. As the carriage comes to a halt, the guards from the castle approach and stop them. Hert throws open the carriage door with a look of anger and urgency. Tessa falls out of the carriage, and Hert gives orders to the guards to lock up all three of them, Tessa, Janet, and Janet's companion. The guards quickly move to follow his commands. Tessa calls his name, sounding desperate. Hert looks at her with a mix of anger and disdain and asks if she thinks he's a fool. Tessa doesn't understand what he means. Suddenly, Hert grabs her hair and yanks her forward, demanding to know if she's enjoyed playing games with him. Tessa quickly says no, she hasn't enjoyed it. Hert then asks how she could betray him like this. Tessa's eyes fill with tears as his words sink in. She realizes he's acting just like he did when he first came to the castle. Hert throws her roughly onto the floor and says he should have never trusted her. He accuses her of selling the jewels so she could escape with another woman. He calls himself a fool for falling for her act. Tessa thinks to herself that this isn't true. She wants to tell him it's not true, but the voices in her head stop her from speaking. Tears start streaming down her face as Hert says it doesn't matter anymore. He's going to make sure she can't run away again. He tells them to take her away. Meanwhile, in Lindenhall, Jeffrey is sweating a lot as he hides in a corner. He's wearing a cloak to stay out of sight from people walking by. He wonders to himself if Ginger Whiskers was really involved in the slave business. Lindenhall is a new estate, and Jeffrey has heard that it's mostly run by deputies of high-ranking lords. It seems like everyone is involved in the slave trade, and security is pretty weak. Jeffrey thinks to himself that the informant might actually be one of Ginger Whiskers' men too. He set up a trap for anyone who tried to dig into Lindenhall, and he ended up walking right into it. Everyone knows that slavery is a serious crime in the kingdom of Meshu. Plus, this area is part of Lee Borwin's territory. What kind of fool would be crazy enough to get involved in this? Jeffrey tells himself he needs to get out of here and report this to Sir Shine, or better yet, the Marquess. One of the men says, "Tut tut, looks like we've got a rat." Jeffrey freezes and stares at them, sweat dripping down his forehead. One of the men hits him with a stick, and Jeffrey falls to the ground with blood running from his forehead. He thinks to himself that he needs to get this message out. In a champagne-colored room, men in suits are playing musical instruments. A blonde-haired man in formal wear stands in front of figures sitting on thrones in a stadium. One of the figures is a young girl with cropped hair and violet eyes. She turns to the young man with brown hair and orange eyes and tells him, "Your Majesty, pay attention now. Don't let a mere duke scare you. Remember who's got your back." The young man starts to protest, but she interrupts him with a firm, "Hush." The blonde man walks up to them and says how honored he is to be here, "Your Majesty." He places his left hand on his chest and bows slightly. The blonde man replies that it's all right, and there's no need for formalities. The blonde man agrees and turns to the young girl. He tells her how lovely she looks, "Your Majesty," and asks if she's been well. He takes her hand and kisses the back of it. She forces a smile and a vein starts to pulse in her neck. She says it's been a while indeed. She pulls her hand away from his grasp and he says, "Then, if you'll excuse me." He moves away to get a glass of red wine and start chatting with other people at the party. She watches him, which annoys her companion. He says, "Jean," and she replies that yes, it's been long enough and he can leave now. He twiddles his fingers and looks away, blushing as he says that's not what he meant to say. She asks what he really meant. He calls her name again and asks if she isn't leaving. She says she's staying a bit longer and asks why he's asking. He gets up from the throne and walks away, saying never mind. He adds that she seems more interested in that duke than in her husband. She tells him not to be an idiot, and says she hates old men anyway. He smiles and asks if that's really the reason she married him. She says yes, and that's why she chose him. He sits back down and asks why she keeps looking at the duke then. She tells him to be quiet and asks when the Duke of Callias returned to Meshu. He says it was 2 years ago. She replies that officially, yes, but he came back secretly before that. He then says that would be before he became king. She asks if that was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, the former king passed away due to old age, and Reims became regent. That's when Callias decided to come back from abroad. Jean says they should end the day. Reims asks if she really means it. She tells him that she always means what she says. Reims and Jean get up from their thrones and leave the party, with guards and maids following them. People at the party bow as they pass by. A man leans in to whisper in the blonde man's ear. The blonde man grins and says, "Is that so? Interesting." Above the crowd, Lee and the purple-haired man watch. The owners of the orphanage are having a tense conversation. The man is pacing back and forth and fidgeting, while the woman sits in an emerald green dress, drinking tea. He asks her why it's taking so long. Does she think they got caught? She frowns and tells him to stay calm, they are just a bit late. He complains that she always says that. What if someone found out? What if they are coming for them? He insists they should leave. She tells him to wait a bit longer, it usually takes this long. Meanwhile, she thinks to herself and wonders why it's taking so long to deal with the girl they sold off 7 years ago. The man runs his hands through his hair and asks how long it can take to find one girl. He's worried something must have gone wrong. If they get caught, it's over for them. Who would have guessed that the gladiator slave would end up being Lee Borwen's right-hand man? What if he's already found the girl? She says that if that were the case, they wouldn't be alive right now. The knocking on the door startles the couple, and they turn to it with fear in their eyes. The door creaks open, and a blonde maid walks in carrying letters. She says the letters are for them and that they are urgent. The woman takes the letters and tells the maid to leave. The maid bows and walks out. The woman starts reading the letters with a frown. Her companion starts sweating and asks what the letters say. She tells him they need to hurry up. She thinks to herself that she was right to be worried about being late. He asks if the letters say that someone has found the girl. Without answering, the woman walks over to her desk. He shouts after her, asking where she's going. She replies, "Where do you think?" "To Linderhall, of course. This is something for the manager to handle. And luckily for us, they've caught a rat." Tessa sits on the bed with her head tucked between her knees. She thinks to herself that she doesn't understand what's happening. She thought Hert would make everything better, and that they were safe now, but things have only gotten worse. She remembers how Hert dragged her into the room and told her they should never have trusted her. He accused her of selling the jewels to run away with that woman. He said she was just waiting for the right moment to betray him. Then he turned and walked out of the room, slamming and locking the door behind him. Tears fill Tessa's eyes as she runs after him and screams that it's not true. She calls his name and pleads with him to believe her. She begs him to open the door. The memory fades, and Tessa wipes the tears from her eyes, muttering to herself that Hert said he believed her, and that he'd wait until she was ready to tell him the truth. Then she calls him a liar. Her sobs are so loud that she doesn't hear the knocking on her door until someone calls out to her using her title. The door creaks open, and Manny walks in. Tessa looks up and sees Manny's face, which is also streaked with tears. The two women rush to each other. Tessa asks the maid if she's okay. Manny says she's fine and that she escaped right after Tessa did. Tessa smiles with relief, saying she was so worried about her. Manny drops to her knees, clasping her hands together, as if she's praying. She begs Tessa to forgive her because she sold the jewelry. She explains that she needed the money desperately, and doesn't know what came over her. Manny says she knows what she did was wrong, but she asks Tessa to please forgive her just this once. She promises it will never happen again. Manny also begs Tessa not to tell Hert, because he will kill her if he finds out. Manny starts to tremble as she explains that she has a family to support and will pay Tessa back, no matter how long it takes. Tessa thinks to herself about how she has seen what happens to servants who steal from their masters at the castle. She sighs and says she'll forgive Manny this time, but she can't make any promises about what will happen next. Manny thanks her over and over. Tessa thinks that maybe if she explains everything to Hert, he might understand. Elsewhere in the castle, Hert stands in the cells and interrogates Janet. Janet frowns and insists that Tessa has nothing to do with this. She grips the bars so tightly that her knuckles turn white. Hert asks her how he's supposed to believe what she's saying. Janet struggles to find the right words. After a while, Janet warns Hert not to cross her because her boss will find out about this. Hert interrupts her and asks, "And then what?" He slams his hand on the bars and says he doesn't care who her boss is. What matters is that she and Tessa went behind his back. He tells her to stop with the nonsense and answer his questions. Janet fidgets, sweat dripping down her face. Hert asks her how many more people like her are in the castle. Janet says she's the only one. He then asks about her relationship with Rang Jeffy. She admits they are lovers. Hert turns away and says never mind, and that she should stay in the dungeon. One of Hert's guards comes to see him and says there's something he needs to know. Hert asks what it is, and the guard tells him. Hert immediately storms out of the dungeons and rushes to Tessa's bedroom. He bursts through the door and demands to know who let Manny into Tessa's room. One of the guards rushes up to Hert and says that the marquis suggested Manny might be the lady's preferred maid. Hert frowns and asks the guard if the marquis is his commander. The guard bows and says no, sir. Hert orders the guard to throw Manny in the dungeon and says he doesn't want to see her again. Tessa cries out in panic, calling his name. Guards come in and escort Manny out of the room. Manny calls out to Tessa using her title. Tessa kneels before Hert and asks if this is really necessary. She begs him to listen to her. Hert tells her to watch her words or she'll make things worse. He asks why she's so concerned about the maid and what she has to do with it. Tessa pleads with him to promise he won't hurt Manny. He asks her why he would hurt Manny. Tessa looks at him, tears streaming down her face, and he starts to feel regret. He goes down on one knee and tells her he won't hurt Manny, so she should stop crying. But he also says that doesn't mean he'll just forget about this. He wants a full explanation from her. Tessa nods. He cups her face and asks why she ran away. She avoids looking at him, and says she didn't run away. He asks why she sold her jewels, and what she was doing with Janet Belrodum at that hour. Tessa stumbles over her words, but manages to say it was Manny, not Janet. He asks what her relationship with Janet Belrodum is. Tessa frowns and says relationship. Janet and she are just friends. Hert rubs his head, feeling frustrated. He asks if she wasn't planning to betray him with Janet after all. Tessa says no, of course not. She insists she never knew Janet was there. She explains that she was kidnapped, but Manny helped her escape. She was running when she met Janet. If Manny and Janet hadn't helped her, the kidnappers would have taken her away. Hert repeats, kidnapped. Tessa nods and says yes. Hert growls and asks if she thinks he's a fool. He grabs her hand, pulls her to her feet, and throws her onto the bed. He stands at the foot of the bed and asks if she really expects him to believe her story. Tessa says no, Hert, it's not a lie, it's the truth. He cuts her off, saying, not a lie. Oh, of course, you have witnesses. Hert says they'll soon find out if she's telling the truth, and they'll talk unless they want to die. Tessa starts to ask him what he means, but then stops and begs him not to do anything. She insists they didn't do anything wrong and asks him to promise that he won't hurt them, because he said he trusted her and believed her. Hert tells her it's too late. He says she should have apologized to him instead of defending that maid. Tears fall from Tessa's eyes as she realizes Hert doesn't believe her, even after he said he would wait for her to explain. She turns to leave, but she grabs his shirt to stop him. He looks at her without turning his head, and she asks what she should do to make him believe her. She says she'll do anything, just please believe her. He repeats her words, asking if she'll really do anything. Tessa says yes, anything. He places his thumb under her chin, and tells her she still doesn't understand what he wants. He pulls her into a hug and says she needs to tell him she wants him, that she can't live without him, and that she loves him. He wants to hear it from her own lips. Tessa thinks to herself, love? She's the one who forced him into this situation. What right does she have to say she loves him? Her silence makes him uncomfortable, and he asks what's taking so long. He wonders if it's so hard to love someone like him. He climbs on top of her on the bed despite her protests. He says it doesn't matter, and she should just accept it. He'll forget she tried to escape if she does. He starts to get intimate with her. Bound to a chair in a dark room, Jeffrey has a bag over his head and can't tell where he is. He figures they must want to know who's backing him since they haven't killed him yet. He tries to wriggle out of the ropes, but can't move. He curses, saying the knots are too tight. He hears the door creak open and someone walks in. The person yanks the bag off Jeffrey's head and slaps him. He calls Jeffrey a rat and tells him to wake up, because time is running out. Blood drips from Jeffrey's mouth as he pleads with the man not to be like this and suggests they can talk things out. The man laughs, walks over to a table full of torture tools, and says he wants to see how long Jeffrey can hold out before he starts talking. Jeffrey glares at the man and says he already told him there's no need for that. If the man has questions, he should just ask them. The man picks up a metal rod and taps it against his palm. He says he has questions, but wants to have some fun first. He asks Jeffrey if his right hand. Jeffrey asks what he means, but the man just repeats his question, saying he's being considerate, and will let Jeffrey keep his preferred hand. Jeffrey tells him to shove it, but the man says he'll pick for him anyway. Just as the man raises the rod to begin the torture, a knock on the door interrupts them. Jeffrey smiles, noting the company. The man doesn't stop, though. He drives the metal rod into Jeffrey's hand, and blood gushes from the wound. The man walks to the door with a smirk. A blonde man in a red robe and a black mask enters. Jeffrey calls out, asking if the new arrival sees the situation. The blonde man tells Jeffrey to be quiet, then picks up a knife and walks toward him. Jeffrey braces himself, thinking the knife is for torture, but the man uses it to cut the ropes binding Jeffrey. Jeffrey watches in confusion as the ropes are removed and the metal rod is pulled from his hand, with blood flowing out. The man takes off his mask and grins, revealing himself. Jeffrey recognizes him and exclaims in surprise. The torturer demands to know who the blonde man is, but before he can get an answer, he is knocked on the head and restrained in Jeffrey's place. Jeffrey wraps a bandage around his hand and asks the blonde man why he's there. The blonde man just flexes his hand and says he always knows where Jeffrey is. Jeffrey frowns and insists that's not what he asked. He questions why the blonde man sent him to Sir Shine if he covered up Shine's past. Jeffrey wants to know the real reason, asking if the blonde man knew about this place too. The blonde man smokes his cigar and says that's all part of his plan. The Duke of Callias is getting too arrogant, but the blonde man doesn't have a reason to go after him, or the other troublemakers who mess up his plans. Sir Shine is his secret weapon. It's lucky he has him, and he just needs to make sure Shine follows his orders. The blonde man throws away his cigar and tells Jeffrey that he's the middleman. Jeffrey asks what he means by that. The blonde man explains that it means Shine will be the next Duke of Callias. Tessa wakes up, covered in hickeys, just as Hert starts to get intimate with her. She jolts awake from a nightmare where her mind was insulting her. She tries to get out of bed, but realizes she can't move her leg. Men dressed as knights stand in an open field. At the same time, Hert talks with Elena and asks if she's offering reinforcements. Elena avoids looking at him and says yes. Hert then asks what she wants in return. Elena says that she's learned it's better to let go of small things to win the bigger prize. Hert crosses his arms and tells her not to speak in riddles. He wants her to be clear about what she wants. Elena tells him she already made her request the last time they met. She says she doesn't ask for much, she just wants to help. Elena explains that she's relying on his goodwill and his position. It seems like he's the one not answering the question. She asks if he will accept her proposal or not. Hert thinks to himself that he doesn't like being tied to the marquis, but he needs to keep a closer eye on Tessa and prepare for any surprise attacks. He agrees to accept her offer, but says that her forces will be watched and completely under his command. Elena says that's fine with her. Hert says he's not sure what Elena really wants, but she should know it won't be easy. Elena calls him by his title and asks if he knows what the most important thing in navigation is. Hert starts to walk away and heads for the door, telling her she shouldn't be talking. Elena cuts him off and says it's the wind. She explains that he needs to find the wind to fill his sails. Without it, all he can do is wait. That's what she's doing, waiting in place until the wind blows again. Tessa looks at the chain on her leg and asks herself what's going on. She hears Hert's voice saying, "You up?" She turns around and sees him wearing a brown shirt tucked into black pants, with a red scarf around his head. He leans against the wall with his arms crossed. He says the chain is just a precaution, nothing serious. Hert sits in bed next to Tessa and asks if she's hungry since she's been asleep for a whole day. Tessa says she's fine, but wants to know what's going on. Hert gently cups her face and asks if it's uncomfortable. He explains that he got the lightest kind, and will try to find something better soon. Tessa says she doesn't like it. Hert tells her that if she hadn't broken her promise by running away, she wouldn't be in this situation. Tessa sighs and says she tried to tell him. Hert says he just needs her to wait until he can make sure everything is okay. Can't she do that for him? Tessa begs him to listen. Hert looks at her, pulls her into his arms, and says since she's not hungry, they'll eat later. That works for him. Tessa stammers, "What?" and Hert kisses her. Then they get intimate. Jeffrey slams his hand on the table and asks if the blonde man is out of his mind. The blonde man calmly inspects his nails and asks if Jeffrey is just now figuring that out. Jeffrey rubs his forehead and says no, he already knew. He knows the blonde man is avoiding the real question. Jeffrey wants to know what made him do something so risky. What if Sir Shine doesn't act the way he expects? The blonde man smirks and says Jeffrey's lack of faith is troubling. When has he ever let him down? Jeffrey tries to protest, but the blonde man cuts him off, saying it's either success or death for him. Jeffrey asks how the blonde man thinks he's gotten this far. He stands by his decision this time too. Jeffrey wants to know if Her Highness is aware of this. She must have tried to stop him. The blonde man turns around and says that's why he didn't tell her. Sometimes, it's necessary to deceive your allies. Jeffrey yells, "Your Grace." The blonde man pats Jeffrey's shoulder and tells him not to be so negative. He already said that retreat isn't an option for him, only victory matters. This time won't be any different. The blonde man is determined to win and rule over everyone. The blonde man talks about Lee as his boss. He explains that Lee got rid of her father, who had cast her out, and her older brothers so she could become the Marquess de Borwin. Then, she removed the former king and put a child in his place, a puppet who couldn't make any decisions. But it didn't stop there. She made her sister the queen, and took over the royal family from the inside out. Jeffrey asks how long the blonde man has been planning all of this. The blonde man thinks for a moment, and says it's been about 2 years. Once he started, he couldn't stop digging and uncovering more secrets. He can hardly believe that the key to everything was just lying around in the trash. He wonders when he'll get another chance like this. That's why he set up this place. He was ready to let Callias live if he stayed away, but Callias got greedy. Jeffrey says that Sir Shine won't just sit back and do nothing when he finds out about all this. The blonde man raises his hands, as if he's giving up, saying it would be foolish to refuse an offer to become a duke. He explains that once someone tastes power, they don't want to give it up. He tells Jeffrey to play along while he's here. Jeffrey starts to sweat and asks, "What do you mean?" Meanwhile, in a brightly lit room, Ferdale paces back and forth, nervously biting his fingernails. He is anxious and worried about what he's gotten himself into. If they lose the war, Dishonor will be the least of his concerns. He fears he might end up losing his life, just like his father did, at the hands of Lee Borwin's forces. Ferdale is uneasy about accepting help from someone he doesn't know well, but he feels he has no other choice, as he needs his troops to stand a chance. A knock on the door interrupts his thoughts. He opens it to find a servant who says that the master wants to see him. Ferdale looks surprised and asks, "Me?" He follows the servant out, muttering to himself about what's happening now. They reach another room, and the servant announces Ferdale's arrival to a man with ginger hair. The man tells Ferdale that they have been expecting him. Ferdale asks what's going on. The man says he has some very good news for him. Ferdale repeats, "Good news." The man snaps his fingers, and the owners of the orphanage walk into the room. The orphanage owners bow to both the man and Ferdale, greeting them. Ferdale looks confused and asks what's going on. The man explains that the orphanage owners have information about Shine's background. The owners nod eagerly, and the male owner says that not only do they know about Shine's origins, but they also know his weakness. He mentions there's a woman he's very attached to. Ferdale asks about the woman and then remembers Tessa, saying she got close to Shine right after his father died. The female owner adds that Tessa and Shine go way back, they are from the same orphanage. Ferdale is confused and asks, "From the same what?" The male orphanage owner explains that Tessa is Shine's weakness. Hearing this, Ferdale's expression darkens. He then asks if that's all the information they have. He tells them they are being ridiculous. He didn't even blink when he threatened to slit Tessa's throat right in front of Shine. He argues that Tessa isn't even worth using as bait. The ginger-haired man strokes his mustache thoughtfully and says they have help on the inside. This is the same person who helped Jeffrey escape. Just then, Jeffrey walks into the room. Ferdale is shocked and shouts, "Jeffrey! He's Shine's deputy, what is he doing here?" Ferdale looks around, demanding to know what is going on and why Jeffrey is involved. Back in the castle, Tessa lies in bed, feeling a deep sadness. She can't stop worrying about Janet and Manny, wondering if they are safe and if everything is all right with them. Her mind is filled with concern as she tries to push her thoughts aside. Suddenly, 3 maids enter her room. The sound of the door opening snaps her out of her thoughts, and she sits up quickly. The maids greet her and say they are there to help her get dressed. Tessa is confused and asks why they are doing this now, out of the blue. The maids explain that it's because of his lordship's orders. Tessa gets out of bed, and the maids begin to help her put on her clothes. As they dress her, Tessa notices that none of her usual maids are present. She wonders where they have gone, feeling a bit uneasy. As she looks around, she realizes how tired and drowsy she feels. It's been a constant state of exhaustion lately, and it seems like she never really feels fully awake or rested. The maids finally finish dressing Tessa, and let her know that his lordship will be arriving soon. Tessa looks down at her navy blue gown. The gown has a corset that fits snugly, and white fabric attached to the chest and legs. Her hair is neatly tucked behind her ears. As she looks at herself, she keeps wondering where her usual maids have gone and feels a deep sense of fatigue. She feels like she's been tired and drowsy all the time lately. While she is lost in thought, Hert walks into the room and calls her name. Tessa looks up and responds to him. Hert approaches her and gently removes the chain from her leg. Then, he lifts her up into his arms as if she's a bride. He tells her that he thought they could take a walk together. Tessa looks at him with a hint of confusion. Hert explains that staying indoors for too long isn't good for her health, so he thought a change of scenery might help. If you're eager for the next chapter, drop a comment expressing your interest in Season 2 Part 2.